Discussing context, please welcome Academy members Andrew O'Hagan and Rachel Cooke, Folio Prize judge Pankraj Mishra, and Folio Prize shortlisted author Rachel Kushner.
I must say it's very encouraging that so many people are here on such a sunny day. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there will be about 15 minutes at the end for questions. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. All right, I'm just going to introduce everyone. I'm Rachel Cooke. I'm a journalist at The Observer. There are two Rachels here today, which if there was a Tory cabinet minister, it would be brilliant for them because there'd be no trouble at all with names. Rachel Kushner's first novel, Telex from Cuba, was published in 2008. It's a complicated story, but with the pace of a thriller, I think, and it's set in revolutionary Cuba in the 50s, but the action takes place mostly in the homes of the expat Americans who sort of silt up the suburbs there. Her second novel, The Flamethrowers, which, as you will all know, is on the shortlist for the Folio Prize, is set in the New York art world of the 70s and in Italy, where our heroine, Reno, goes to stay with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend's father is a tire magnate, but he's also formerly a futurist and a fascist, perhaps. James Wood called the book scintillatingly alive. I think I called it amazing, which is why James Wood earns the big bucks. Pankraj Mishra was born and educated in India. He is an acclaimed novelist, critic, and more recently writer of non-fiction. The Believer magazine once described him as a sort of maverick scholar. I don't know how you feel about that. You can tell me later. Among his books are An End to Suffering, The Buddha in the World, and Temptations of the West, How to be Modern in India, Pakistan, Tibet and Beyond. His last book, From the Ruins of Empire, was published in 2012, and it was a history of Asian intellectual responses to Western colonialism. And finally, Andrew O'Hagan is an award-winning novelist and essay writer, and he's also a professor of creative writing at King's College London. He's published 4 novels, most recently The Life and Opinions of Math, the dog and his friend Marilyn Monroe, and 2 works of non-fiction. 2 of his books have been adapted for the theatre. His recent essay in the London Review of Books about the period he spent trying and failing to be Julian Assange's ghostwriter looks likely to be the most memorable and talked about piece of journalism to be published in 2014, and it's only March. I think the other panels in this festival, they probably had a slightly easier task than us. They talked about structure and voice and things like. We're going to be talking about context, which seems to me to be a huge subject. Even with our literary crampons on, we're only going to get into the foothills, and it means so many different things to so many different people. When we were emailing each other before the event, we all immediately had different responses. So I'm going to begin by asking each member of our panel to talk about what they think of first when someone asks them about context. So Pankraj, why don't you start?
I think of, when you grow up in a place like India, reading novels where the context is alarmingly absent completely. I'm thinking of a novel like Sentimental Education, with which I had a lot of problems initially because it's set in an era about which I think even most people in England today would know very little. 1848 revolutions, the disillusionment caused by that, which hangs very heavy over the novel. So it's very difficult really to understand. I think the other novels, Flaubert, are much less historical, easier to access, but there were several such books from the 19th century, also from the 20th century. So in that sense, context was something that had to be cracked, that had to be understood if you wanted to understand literature. I mean, that was the task for, I think, all of us. I would presume to say, readers in places like India. It's only much later in my life that I've encountered a kind of reading which does away with socio-historical, political context altogether, where experiences and memories and histories are instinctively shared without any kind of explicit invocation of them. I mean, that is obviously a community of readers that mostly exists in the richer, more developed societies of the Western world, because they, the traditions, literary traditions or traditions of modern literature have been around. They're much older than those in India, and the relationships that the reader has with the text, all of that has been sufficiently mediated by other texts, by other kinds of knowledge, whether it's history or sociology, and of course journalism too. So that's been an interesting experience, encountering these particular communities of readers where context is not so important. But as I said, in most parts of the world, I'd say that's actually overwhelmingly present.
Rachel, how about you? What was the first thing you thought of when you realised you would be doing this event?
I'm tripped up now thinking about sentimental education. Well, as I just asked Rachel when we were preparing to walk on stage, I didn't know if context meant the context in which a work was written or the context in which it's read. And clearly the way that Pankraj answered the question, I think he was addressing the issue of the reader. Sentimental education is a work that goes into very specific detail about what happened to a certain generation, over the course of the 1848 revolution and the lost ideals of revolutionary France. But I think there's really, for me, there is definitely a place for novels like that do something with people as historical subjects and tries to activate the way in which people are constructed by the world in which they live and the social class from which they come. It's something that I relate to also as a reader. But then there's a novel like Blindness by Jose Saramago, and I think anyone could react and feel something, in the experience of reading that book without knowing anything about, for instance, the Carnation Revolution and dictatorial Portugal. It's not necessary in order to read the book. So in thinking about the term context, when I first heard about the panel, I guess I was just thinking about my own experience writing my most recent novel, which was a kind of intermeshing for me of devoting and subjecting myself to a particular passage of history, and then also living in one and wanting to be a sensitive writer in terms of, I guess, interpolating what was going on around me as I wrote my book. Like I thought immediately, it's a little tidy, but this is what I thought of. When I was writing the book, one of my, I guess, one of the initial poetic images that inspired me and made me want to write the novel were these kind of classical photographs of the blackout in New York City in July of 1977. And it's famously the bad blackout in New York, because there was another blackout in the Northeast in '65 when everyone behaved, people were genteel, neighbors helped one another, etc. And then in '77, there was this rage in Brooklyn and the Bronx. And white middle-class people said, but what's happening? Why is everyone so angry? But New York had been in a recession. There's all these reasons for this event, as one could call it, to have occurred. As I was writing my big blackout scene, Mark Duggan was killed by the police. And I had all these friends who were writing long and thoughtful articles about the figure of the looter and what looting means. And I don't think I could have done that scene in the book, and nor would it have been that interesting for me if I wouldn't have been living against the texture of issues that were arising in my time. So to me, that is context.
So already we're realizing that context is this, shifting, it's a constantly shifting thing, and that it's permeable because, the reader and the writer are in a relationship, and that relationship goes on for, decades and centuries even. Andy, what about you?
I think one of the aspects of being a novelist is the extent to which you are able to mobilize context. From the beginning, I've believed in that personal contexts, historical, social context too, and indeed the contexts that are offered by form. I mean, if you write a novel, then you are already confronting, sometimes in a state of vertigo, the whole tradition of the novel, or at least the tradition of the novel in which you see yourself broadly writing. So, you know, to stick with Flaubert for a second, but to switch to another novel, the more famous perhaps, Madame Bovary, if you go to this day to a particular town in Normandy called Rie, and you go to the graveyard there, and go to the back of the graveyard, you'll see a stone to a certain woman who died in 1850 called Delphine de la Mer, which some exciting postmodernist has scratched out and written Emma Bovary. And if you look into the context of the writing, the researching and long, painstaking composition of that book, what you find is that, indeed, the nearby dwelling, Gustave Flaubert was obsessed with the story of Delphine de la Mer, who was married to a local doctor and had an affair and poisoned herself. And the scandal around it was incredibly gripping to the people around Flaubert, and especially to him. So in a sense, there was a biographical context in which he was attaching himself, but obviously had to ring bells in other ways within him as an artist, to do with his own life, perhaps, to do with his sense of the novel, to do with his sense of style. I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about those items individually, but we won't. But the fact is that the context like that has always been something that's drawn me as a reader. I want to find the context behind certain works. It interests me, as it might not interest others. I mean, in a previous discussion preparing for this, Pankraj mentioned the new critics, and of course we know about a critical period when this sort of thing was thought to be irrelevant, that a work of art was self-contained and well-wrought, either beautiful or not beautiful, but no more interesting because it was written by somebody with manic depression than if it wasn't. Or whether it was written in New Orleans or written in Glasgow, it made no difference.
A tiny part of me still feels bad that we're even having this discussion, because I was at university when that movement was, you know, and we were constantly being admonished for knowing that, you know, Sylvia Plath had been unwell.
Well, that's right. It seems so pure in a way, but it seems to me a missed opportunity, especially for literary critics, but possibly for readers in general, that to know that Sylvia Plath had a particular experience with children, with depression, with having a mother like that, with having a husband like that, with being left like that. I mean, all of that might or might not make the poems more interesting, more explicable, more linguistically reachable. It's possible. But just to be autobiographical for a second, growing up as I did in the west coast of Scotland, there was a very strong context in which every writer and reader was aware they were reading or writing, and that was to just try and capture it in a phrase, was standard English, that there was a received pronunciation issue, that if you had a strong accent and you had a strong sense of your language that you used at home talking to your mother, being very much the vital and instinctive language you used, but not being, as it were, the language of literature, that somehow the language of literature and all the attendant class aspects that would attach themselves to that were somehow somewhere else. And a whole generation of writers came along, and I don't just mean in Scotland. I think that Pankraj would be interesting in the extent to which people from outside the standard English tradition, not only in speaking, but the sense of a literature that was, you know, absolutely legitimate as a literature. Whereas if you spoke with a certain kind of working class accent and you started to write in that way, in the way that somebody like James Kelman did, or you brought in, or even Angela Carter in a different way, bringing a different kind of language and silence into the English sentence that came from a different place, then suddenly you were interrupting the established context. You were, in a sense, messing up the accepted context for being a literary writer.
Yes.
And I think that was obviously political in the 80s. It was Thatcherism behind it. All these contexts suddenly come into play. I mean, the new critics would have a fit at this point.
Yeah,
it was all context, and some of those writers, as I think to use a phrase of yours, are all context.
Yes.
We don't know if they survive their context.
I mean, we were talking about the fact that, well, I've most recently been writing about the 1950s, and it struck me when I was reading texts from the 1950s that there were some things which just no longer make any sense because we would now think they are just all context. The perfect example of that would be Look Back in Anger to me, which works only if you know that it was a bomb under the theatrical establishment. But if you just read it as a new critic would want you to, it just doesn't really function. To me, it doesn't. Whereas there are other books from that period which just sail on. You know, they break free of their context, I suppose.
You thought maybe Lucky Jim would be an
Yes,
example.
I think Lucky Jim, although it's so much set in a particular world, in a particular place, about people of a particular social class, it nevertheless seems to have a continuing life. Well, it does to me. Whereas, you know, Malcolm Bradbury's The History Man, which is very similar to it in many ways, it to me is just dead now in a way I can't quite...
I think you find that when you look at Joyce, you know, that one of the reasons Joyce is so fantastic is because he overcame context. The context is absolutely central. Every single story in Dubliners is soaked in context. And every page, of course, of Ulysses is saturated with context. Just what people would have drank at that particular time on a particular day in that season of the year. You know, it's all context, and yet, unlike so many short stories set in Dublin that were written, hundreds and thousands of them published in magazines like The Bell, we don't know who those writers are anymore. Joyce was able to transcend somehow the localism of time and context.
Pankraj, you said to me in an email about, you know, the idea that context can inhibit, or that, you know, for instance, writers in Asia can't not be aware of the context. Would you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that does connect.
And I think going back to what Rachel said earlier about, you know, two ways of looking at it, one from the writer's perspective and the others. Now, if you look at it from the writer's perspective, the question of audience immediately looms up and sometimes becomes impossible to deal with, because your audience is actually not around you. It's elsewhere. For many people writing in English, for instance, in India today, or in Kenya or Nigeria, especially in places like Pakistan, India now has this, you know, growing audience of readers who read in English. But if you're writing in English, then you are actually looking at a readership abroad. And you are writing, most of us writing about India, about Indian realities, which are largely unknown outside of India. So you take on a burden of explanations. Within the novel, you're actually providing an interpretive frame as well. You're providing the context to, you know. So this actually, I mean, I think artistically inhibits a lot of writers, where they find themselves actually, you know, providing a larger frame, providing a social historical frame, so that other people who know nothing about that particular history can understand, can follow this. Because they know that that reader out there is not going to make the effort that readers in India have of figuring out what the 1848 revolutions were about. They're not going to go around and find out what the 1975 emergency in India was about. So let's have an explanation embedded there in the text of the novel. So that, I think, can be quite, I would say, I mean, inhibiting is a mild word to use, but can often be destructive of the artistic content in a particular book. But I want to ask Rachel, because both of your novels have had a lot of, I mean, they're set in sort of very particular, very clear historical situations. Whether as a writer, what do you think makes the work of art actually transcend its context in the way Joyce's stories obviously did, and sort of, you know, the ones you described back in the 1950s? Another figure that comes to mind, Angus Wilson.
Yes, who no one reads now.
Yes, from the 50s. There are others too. Colin McInnes, who were also, I mean, writing about that. Mind you, I mean, Look Back in Anger was being read simultaneously around the world. It's amazing to discover that it was a great hit in Egypt, for instance. A lot of people...
you mean recently?
At the time. Oh. At the time.
I just thought maybe you were suggesting that it was really helpful in places that were getting angry, that they suddenly needed angry text. Should have an angry reading list to take around Tahrir Square.
So, I mean, there was something there that was making it making that work transcend its immediate context and become appealing to readers in India or Egypt and elsewhere. There were a lot of people trying to write like Osborne at that time. I don't know if something similar happened to Kingsley. But anyway, sorry to
it's
go
okay.
on.
Should I answer?
Please.
Yeah.
To the best of my ability. It's mysterious what makes something a work of art, which is not to claim to have made works of art, but to render or summon into life a particular historical episode is not at all what I consider to be my job as a writer. I'm engaged with history because it's simply part of life. To have some awareness of historical processes and how the world has come to be the way that it is. And I'm sure every writer feels this way, but when you sit down to write, what you want to find is, you want to make your way through the layers of awareness in your own consciousness and get to that kernel that is the thing about life that only you know. And everyone has those kernels. And then you put them into a kind of accretion that is a book, and the book has to have a subject. And for me, oftentimes, the subject is just something in which I've taken a natural interest, like the 1970s in Italy and the movement of '77, which was, a kind of labor and mass movement that took place there that was of interest, not just to me as a novelist, but the community of people, my own intellectual community and friends. Everybody was reading the autonomous, during the Occupy movement. And I was reading all the autonomous too, but in order to write fiction. And it's a different project entirely. But I wanted to go back to the Madame Bovary thing, because I think that that's a book that functions on multiple valences, but on two that are relevant to this conversation. And one is that, people think of it as the magnificent realist novel, right? Everyone can feel all of the suffering and the venality and the fears and the greed of Madame Bovary. But on the other hand, when you read that book carefully, you see so much of Flaubert and his hatreds. And he detests Voltaire. He hates him so much, and the way that Voltaire rises up in the form of the putridly positivistic pharmacist. I'm sorry, that was really lumpy. I'm jet lagged, but I just got here from Australia. But, I read that novel as a teenager, but then to read it again as an adult, you go, oh my God, this is just vicious. So it's a book that exists on both frequencies, and then classically, the kind of failed historical novel, meaning the one that is deracinated from a living context, is Salammbô, because it's about Carthage. And so it's considered to be, Lukács famously called it, this dead, glittering object. It's a piece of history that has absolutely no relevance to 19th century bourgeois France. And I just found recently there's a letter that Flaubert wrote about that. I think it was to Maxime Duchamp, but I'm not sure. It might have been to Louise Colette. And he says, you have no idea how depressed a person has to be to recreate Carthage. So that's what I would call a lack of context.
One of the things I'd like to say before you go on to the next bit, Rachel, is to ask you a question, actually. And it's to do with context. One of the things I think we take for granted as fiction writers, but I would argue good non-fiction writers do it too, is to replenish context. The 1950s are so often spoken about in this country as a kind of very, very, very poor cousin to the 60s.
Yes.
That in some sense that the lights were switched on in the 60s and youth was invented and, as it were, a kind of political engagement was invented. But what you've done in your recent book is to sort of suggest that the 50s had a lot more going on than what we previously thought. That's an example of a kind of not just a rejuvenation, but replenishing the idea that a decade isn't all you thought it was.
I think the tricky thing about if you're going to be thinking about context in terms of history, and Pankraj knows this, you then have to challenge the history, because history is made by the people who write it in just the same way that a novel is. So you do always have to be going back, and also each generation has to go back because you bring a different kind of investigation to it. I mean, I went back to the 50s because it began to feel to me as though it was a cliche, that it was this sepia time, and that, you know,
but these women were all putting sort of cakes into the oven.
And my instincts told me, I'm not a historian, but my instincts told me that that couldn't be right, and it was worth challenging. And that can be really rich. And I think I'm definitely not a novelist because I have no imagination, but I have sort of novelistic instincts in that. I'm very interested in the small quotidian things that somehow throw light on the whole. And you know, and then it helps you to a greater understanding of your own time as well, because people are always throwing into the conversation this phrase, oh, it's like the 50s around here. Yeah. And now I always say, well, what do you mean by that? You know, because it wasn't.
Well, that's what I meant.
It
sort of changes your sort of urge to do that. You don't. I mean, I don't know that I would ever say. I mean, I think I always imagined the 50s was my mother's period before she had us and got unhappy, and it was about. That's a joke. She's delirious. The 50s were a kind of a dark period almost in the way people talked about them. But my mother talks about the 50s as a great creative period for her and her friends, and not just about being young, but, you know, they weren't in the dark.
And also, I mean, on the flip side of challenging the history, in a funny way, that I think a fault of a lot of contemporary historians is that they don't read all the novels and poetry of a particular time. So if you read some of the big books about the 50s, which are many of them by men, they're all about, you know, Anthony Eden, Suez, all of that. They've never read any of the novels written by women who published books in 1948 and 1952. Although they're novels, they tell you amazing things about that time that you can't get anywhere else. Yeah. And so I think it is a real two-way street. But I wanted to ask you, because you have now written 2 books that are connected to, for want of a better word, celebrity. Yeah. And a context of our life now is, you know, that seems to be an engine of 21st century life, is celebrity, and in many, you know, different realms. And I wondered if that was something that you had consciously set out to reflect in your novels, or because your first novel, Personality, the first of those 2, I think in a way you almost anticipated it, because you...
It was quite early, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, I started working that book before The X Factor or Britain's Got Talent, any of that, and I was really referring back to a previous, you know, a 1970s version of that, Opportunity Knocks, and all that sort of talent show that exists in Britain. In quite a low level, when you look at it now, it looks quite cute. You know, that you won a sort of, you know, a toaster, and you got to be 14th on the bill at Blackpool for a season. You know, it was a different world. You didn't get sort of turned into an international superstar or whatever is supposed to happen now. But I'll tell you what, Rachel, what happened. I can't speak for other novelists. They'll have their own tale to tell. But you don't choose, you know, a theme, as it were, thinking, oh, celebrities in the air. It's more that it's sort of going in and out of your pores and going in and out of the pores of your generation. I mean, I began to notice that at the end of the 90s that it wasn't just that celebrity was mentioned more, but it was that people exuded an interest in celebrity. And I believe even before selfies, that they started to have an attitude to their own lives as if they were celebrities. People started looking at their experience as if they could be famous. Yes. And the technology, of course, has enhanced that. And now people are their own paparazzi. But I wanted to write a novel that somehow entered into the world of that, and Personality really began for me the day the centre of the book, without going on too long, is she's an 11, 12-year-old girl who becomes very famous as a singer and then starts to become very ill. And I went to a girls' school very early in the research for the book, about the year 2000 or 1999, and I was in a classroom in this school, and there was, I think, 40 girls in the class, and I gave them all a piece of paper and asked them to write down what they wanted to be when they grew up. And about 72 or 3% of what came back either said the word famous or an equivalent word, celebrity or a pop star or something like that. And that just wouldn't have happened in my school
No, that's a new
in the 70s. It was a new thing, and it sort of played into this sense I had that, as I said, seeping in and out of the pores, that And that was a context, definitely. The context was that the world had changed, but it hadn't produced the novel that I wanted to read. I mean, selfishly, I mean, I tend to write books that I would quite like to read myself,
absolutely.
if I can't find them out there.
Pankraj, when you when Mo-Yan got the Nobel Prize, there was a lot of debate about, you know, the context in which he was writing. I wonder, I mean, especially with reference to what Andy's just said, to what degree do you think it's the responsibility of a novelist to reflect context? Because every year, especially at prize time, there's a debate about, you know, there are too many historical novels, or there's this dread word that I hate, which is relevant, you know, nothing's relevant. And I mean, what do you feel about the novelist's responsibility on that score?
It's so easy to sound like those Soviet cultural commissars, you know, laying down prescriptions for what writers. I mean, I think, you know, one basic qualification, which I think we probably could all agree upon, there's some dissatisfaction with the world, with your society as it exists today. I think that's good enough, you know, and I think a lot can be generated out of that feeling if it's strong enough, if it's passionate enough. And certainly Flaubert had that with that. Intense hatred of the bourgeoisie who were rising, who were taking over. And you see that in Thomas Mann in a different way altogether. You see that in almost every major writer. Maybe that helps them, you know, transcend their particular context. But with Mo-Yan, or indeed, you know, people writing in societies, in nation states, where there are very, you know, explicit restrictions on what they can say in public, they can get away with quite a lot of things in their art, in novels, in films, and I think they should really be assessed. These writers should be assessed by what they actually do in their fictions, and I think that's where context becomes very important. You have to really understand Mo-Yan's relationship with the Cultural Revolution, or the ways in which Cultural Revolution can be written about and has been written about in China, to understand his achievement or lack of it. It's not enough to say that, you know, this man has not taken an explicit stand against the CCP, the communist regime, and that he's not denounced it when he could have in various platforms that he has enjoyed. I think we have to look very closely at what has been produced, and, you know, someone like Mahfouz in Egypt, who actually worked for the government, who worked for a government which was cracking down on novelists. Who's the writer, I'm trying to remember now, in Russia, who worked for the censors? Was it Oblomov?
Yeah.
Was it him or Aksakov?
Yeah. Oh, well done. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's always, you know, these sort of weird instances of people who've had to work with the censors, looking over their shoulders, and shape their work in ways which escape the scrutiny of the censors and actually still become alive with criticism, with some sort of an oppositional stance.
Right, Rachel, it seems, I mean, it's a preposterous thing to call your book a historical novel, because that doesn't seem to do it at all, but it is a historical novel in that it's not set in the present. But is that, I mean, you hinted at it when you were talking about Occupy. It's a sort of sly way of interrogating 21st century politics, isn't it, through something that is similar but different?
And that sort of happened over the course of writing the book. But yeah, I don't consider it at all a historical novel. Something I've, you know, spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think at the moment my answer to it, why I don't call it historical, even though the book is largely set in history, is that I think a writer should have some conception of time and history. And whether you set a novel in the present, or you set it 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you're still enacting some kind of conception, or finding a way to meet yourself at the other end, you know, make a kind of historical appointment with yourself to understand, you know, a time and a set of characters and what happens over the trajectory of the book. Whether it's set in the present or it's set in the past, for me, the construction and the intellectual engagement with it would be the same. Like, I wouldn't write a contemporary book that was just sort of larded up with contemporary details. I'd need to have some engagement with my own time. When you write about the past, you simply have one more tool in your toolbox, which is a lot of hindsight. And there's a lot of materials that have been produced, and so that you could see what the effects of certain things have been, like the promise of the movement of 77, as it's called in Italy, is potentiality. It ended with the assassination of the former prime minister, Aldo Moro. We all know how that went. Then we got Ratzinger and Berlusconi, you know. But, and these things start to recede a little bit when you write fiction, because I'm not a historian, I'm a fiction writer, you know. I imagine things, and poetic logics come into place, and my own unconscious comes in to play with it. So, yeah, I mean, there are writers like DeLillo. I don't think of him as a historical novelist, but to me, maybe he's somebody whose work has meaning for me in terms of like Underworld and
I totally understand what you mean. I suppose what I meant was that, is it in some way easier, better, more appealing to write about the recent past than about what's going on now?
No, it isn't. I mean, I'm writing a contemporary novel now, so, you know, it just happens to be the case that, I mean, a writer encounters a subject, and in a way I almost think, I mean, it does matter what your subject is, but you're going to write the book you're going to write, or at least I am, no matter what subject I choose, except I'm not going to choose Carthage. May I respond really quickly to something that Pankraj said that was so interesting, and I agree with him about Mo Yan, and maybe because I spent a lot of time in Cuba, it started to hit me after a while that no one really actually has the right to say what kinds of decisions a person working under a regime with no freedom of speech should do, or how they should proceed, until you have lived in those conditions. It's just really impossible to know, because people are not free to share their opinions. And so that's just a really kind of interesting example of context, I think, the debate surrounding his award and the decisions that he's made.
No,
so.
I agree. Now I just want to, we are sort of, the time's going on, you know, and we've only really started on we've just gone over the style and we've put our stone on the first cairn. But anyway, I just want to talk a little bit about the market, because it's an inescapable fact that, you know, you're all writers who must be published or want to be published, and, you know, one must make a living. And that is part of the context, isn't it? I wonder if you could just each say something a little bit about the pressures of that, because it is, there is an ongoing debate about, you know, people who write to the market and the way that books are marketed, and that crowds out certain voices. And Pankraj, we were talking about this in the green room. And
no, I mean, the market is a huge force in the lives of people who lack readerly communities. I think, you know, you have to identify, if you're a writer in places with no publishing cultures locally to speak of, then you have to identify your reader, you have to identify your particular market, and really, and many people are actually accused of writing for that particular market, of catering to that particular audience that exists. So that, and there are indeed lots of writers doing that, and their work is determined far too much by that imperative to basically be able to be published and, you know, get it publicized, get it reviewed. You have to write in a certain way. If you write with too much local knowledge, which is not accessible to your reader, thousands of miles away, you will not get published. So you have a fraught relationship with the market right from the beginning. You know, right from the beginning of your career. And it's very difficult to get away from it, really, because, you know, soon what happens is you get anointed as a spokesperson for a particular country or a society, or sometimes even religion. You know, there are a whole lot of people out there supposed to be speaking up on behalf of Islam. A lot of fiction writers. So I think these are the kind of traps that you know, you find yourself in when you when you're forced to write for a particular audience, you write for particular markets. That's one instance of. I want to actually come back to a figure who suddenly reared up when we were talking about Flaubert and his hatred of the bourgeoisie, also the 1950s, Updike, who did not exactly adore the bourgeoisie, but he was indulgent towards it. Very much a figure of the 1950s, very much a figure of post-Cold War America too, who wrote, I suppose you could look at the four Rabbit novels and see in them a very broad sociological panorama of America from the late 1950s onward or so. But someone who was very attentive to context, especially of his own times, but really failed to be critical of it. And yet, he had this audience, certainly most of it American. He had a very well-established, a very large market that he could write for and keep writing.
Yeah, it's so strange with it. There's a group of writers like that, I think, who sort of learned to love the context they hated. Updike would be one, and John Cheever would be another. They actually lived in those sort of desperate suburbs that they ended up writing about. And of course, the New Yorker became a kind of context for those writers too, where a certain love of a kind of terrible suburban experience came to be enjoyed by the people who lived in those suburbs and who bought that magazine.
DeLillo calls that genre around the house and in the yard.
Yeah.
You see the limit of it. I mean, that's such a cutting...
So even coming from a very different house and a very different yard, I remember being struck by that point that you've started us out on, is that Updike, for all his achievements as a stylist, had kind of drunk the Kool-Aid and sort of joined the sort of horror show that he was revealing.
I know, but just to stick up for John Updike.
I love that.
I mean, I don't, not criticising. I don't know. I mean, this goes back to what we were just talking about. I don't think you necessarily have to criticise everything you write about. You may be writing from a completely different place, and I think that's just as valid. I mean, the reason why I love Updike, I hate the suburbs, but I love this essential human truths, what a man and a woman say to each other in that moment of love, loathing, sex.
Absolute genius of creation of context and sort of mobilising those contexts, sometimes with enormous ambivalence. I think that's certainly what I would say is that he, I don't dislike him for, and I don't think that he should criticise the suburbs more or anything.
No.
I think that he's got a very healthy and sort of riveting ambivalence about it, that he does show the kind of lurid horror of those. Remember that bit at the beginning of the first Rabbit book when he comes into the diner, Rabbit, this athletic sort of, he's not on the turn yet, but he's beginning, his life's not quite what it would have been had he been the star basketball player. And it is on the turn, and he's in this, he and his former coach are in this diner. There's something about the way the light plays against the women's faces in the diner that makes it clear that there's a sort of immense disgust about the loss and trappedness and imprisonment and so on. But he manages it, and it makes you, well, more than approve of it. You can't wait to get to the next book and see more of it.
I think, I think Cheever, because you mentioned Cheever, I think Cheever's slightly different to Updike because strangely, to bring biography in, Updike seems to have been a happier man. Cheever, very unhappy. But actually, when you look at the novels, the opposite, because, as you say, there is disgust and unhappiness in Updike, whereas, this is my own reading of Cheever. He's a writer who's always moving towards the light, and that's why there's something so beautiful. Yes,
but Bullet Park is such a dystopic
novel.
But
the stories are these little epiphanies, and that's what makes them beautiful. And
you've revealed a whole new vista. Actually, I mean, the whole thing about happiness and unhappiness in a writer as a context.
Yes.
Very unhappy writers creating brilliant comedies, for instance, or the opposite. Relatively happy individuals writing incredibly depressing books like me.
Yes. Rachel, do you want to say something before we...
Well, we drifted from the marketplace.
Yes, we did.
Should we go back to the marketplace?
Yeah, I wondered if you wanted to say something about Cheever, because you just had such a look of horror on your face.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I don't think of him as that happy, but or as his writing is uplifting, but I think he's... For some reason, I've never been an Updike fan. Cheever is much more interesting to me. But also, maybe it's partly that when you read his journals and the letters that he wrote, he was so incredibly brilliant. And he had just a turn of phrase and a kind of felicity and an access to knowledge and material. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I've delved much more into kind of the Cheever realm and the way that he sort of like wanted to be an American blue blood, but he was gay. It's like, there's more there for me, kind of, than the Updike
you see,
thing.
now we're onto this very fraught
just
area.
about marriage.
Now you're onto this very fraught area, which is, you know, biography. And I mean, I think this is increasingly, what's the right word? Toxic. It can have a toxic effect on our literary culture.
Can I say something about that, actually? Because
Yeah.
I was thinking of something that you were saying earlier, like about when Andrew mentioned Sylvia Plath, or Rachel did, one of the two. You know, in certain senses, there's a way in which the work itself actually dissolves the distinctions between New Critic's idea of the text alone, deracinated, standing for itself, and, you know, the behind-the-scenes context in which the author wrote the work. I mean, in a way, the salient features of the work should function in both senses, but to be apparent to the reader in the work itself. So I'm only talking about what I glean from reading Cheever, not from knowing anything about his life. It's sort of like when you read Proust, I don't need to go back and know that Madame de Guermantes was based on blah, 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 blah person. I just know that Proust is so dedicated to making me understand what's atrocious about what he would think of as the worldly signs, that he must have experienced this, and moreover be telling something to me,
but you know,
about this lost era of French society.
I suppose what I meant was that in the old days, people didn't really know very much about their revered novelists. So, you know, when George Eliot died, her husband wrote, you know, hagiography saying of George, she was the best person ever to live, and everyone just, you know, read that and bought that. But now we live in a biographical culture, and it is part of the way in which we read writers now. I mean, you know, the example that always upsets me is the one of Philip Larkin, where, you know, Andrew Motion published his biography, and then people, like certain academics who will remain nameless, said, I won't teach Larkin because he wasn't right with women, and you know, and that has become a toxic
That's been going on for a long time, though. I mean, just look at the life of Martin Heidegger, you know, and Paul de Man. There's just a new book that just came out about him, right? I mean, these are like really important architects of 20th century thought who were totally defrocked for their relationship to the Nazis. I mean, so this has been happening for quite a long time.
The difference is that they are philosophers, and we're talking about fiction, and, you know, whether we expect our novelists to be
but isn't it kind of the same thing in a way, like how you live and what you create? I don't know, to me it's...
Well, you think they are the same thing?
Well, it's, I mean, if you think that the biography of the person matters, like in terms of, you know, if you share their values or not, I mean, what you're saying basically is that some people have to share the values of the novelist in order to enjoy the product of their work.
I'm certainly not saying that I do, but yeah.
Yeah, sure, but that's the issue. But I think the issue is the same, essentially. Like, you either look at Heidegger's contributions to philosophy, or you negate those based on what you happen to have come to know about his private life.
You don't necessarily negate them, you might enrich them.
Yeah. Or you keep the two separate. I don't know, but I think I'm not, I don't pay that much attention to the biographies of people. I'm less interested in that than in the work that they make.
I'm thinking of the sort of literary version of Heidegger, Celine or Ernst Junger, Gottfried Benn. I mean, hugely enjoyable books. And I wonder whether the sort of darkness they carried around in their souls actually, you know, made the text much more.
Oh, for sure, with Celine.
Yeah, and Dostoevsky too. I mean, you know, complete reactionary politically, of course, but there is something, I suppose, you know, there's something he's working out in the writing that makes it so compelling.
I think one of the aspects of the contemporary novelist, if we can use that broad term, is if you take a novelist, to stick with an American example, we've used a few, of Saul Bellow, where a writer, a novelist, famous novelist, can come to seem somewhat haunted by their future biographer. That their effort, if you follow me, you know, to use whatever they use consciously and unconsciously in their work. You know, in a post-Freudian world, we can accept that, you know, bad marriages might end up, you know, not underpinning, but certainly infusing certain characters in novels that one might write.
Yes.
That's a no-brainer in a way. But a new element, I think, is the sense that the use of that material and, as it were, the acting out of an unconscious by a novelist is slightly sort of estranged and haunted by the idea of what the truth teller will do with it in the future.
Absolutely.
And Sobel seemed to me incredibly like that. Ravelstein seems to be a novel that's haunted by the notion of an afterlife. The sort of James Atlas figure is waiting in the wings to tell the truth. And that's unfortunate in a way, because if that had happened to a parallel novelist like Dostoevsky, we would have been fucked.
Yes.
Maybe
he would have been, anyway.
Maybe that's why Philip Roth is appointed a biographer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but
control from beyond the day.
the thing is,
Exactly.
you can't control it, can
Yeah.
you? Because one day someone else will do another one.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, we need to, because this is so interesting, isn't it? But the trouble is, it's 20 past. So,
Oh, yeah.
does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Yes, lady with the V on the chest. Yes.
Does that mic come?
Hi, hello. A question really picking up on something that Rachel Kushner said, talking about having the additional tool of hindsight when you're writing fiction that's set in the past. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how double-edged that can be, because as the writer you have the hindsight, but the characters operating in that time period in the work that you're writing don't, and how do you avoid artificially giving them hindsights they couldn't possibly have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I suppose it's one of the technical matters that the writer encounters. In the case of my own recent novel, Flamethrowers, the narrator for most of the book is a young woman, and she goes, for example, to Italy and will not have any of the knowledge that I have about that time. But it was formally more interesting to me to do things that way, because the characters and the scenes that they encounter are not sort of set pieces for me to what they call information dump and let the reader know what happened with this or that history. There has to be a quotient of mystery for me, and the mystery is how she would feel encountering something enormously complicated that's happening around her that she doesn't really have the faculties to understand. And so then the component of restraint becomes really important, and it's something, I guess, that I want to abide by as a writer, which is to know a lot more than I release into the body of the book.
Can I add something? I think there's sometimes a sense in which it takes a while for periods to settle down. It's a technical issue for novelists, and I think it explains partly why some novelists, not all, but there's no generality about this, but some novelists need there to have been a decade or two just to let it sit down. I mean, that was certainly Tolstoy's position in the most famous example, but very often, it's not that you can't write about today, it's just that today hasn't quite finished yet.
Yes.
You know, it's not quite settled down. And as a novelist, it's about context and about understanding context. And sometimes a novelist, just for one novel or sometimes for a whole career, but in the case of DeLillo, for one novel, came a cropper, as I would think of it, writing too close to a period that hadn't settled. And it is when he wrote Falling Man, that 9/11, and so many people, by the way, who wrote about 9/11 came to grief on those rocks, I would argue, that the event was more sensational than the writing about it could possibly be. That there was a sort of false competition set up between the image of planes flying into a building and a certain kind of beautiful prose that tried to capture it. I remember the aforementioned John Updike writing in the New Yorker about how the second plane going in was like somebody posting a letter at speed. You thought, not quite.
No.
You know, and everybody who described it that way.
No, it was a little worse than that.
Yeah, it was a little worse than that. It was the failure of metaphor that day, among many more
There
important
was Martin
things.
Amis too, sharking in, the planes sharking in.
Yeah, every metaphor failed that day.
Well, you know, DeLillo, I love his work, and I hate to say this, but he made a terrible mistake in Falling Man. He made his terrorist an Iraqi.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Yes.
I was just thinking about Pankraj, what you were bringing up earlier, and sort of how much should the novelist explain the history, include information about the history or not, to help the reader understand. And I was actually thinking about, Rachel, your novel, and I was really interested in the bits of historical context that pop up in the narrative, like Reno's boyfriend growing up in Alexandria, or the bit in the South American rabbit industry, where they seemed to really affect how I read the more modern storyline. But then I wondered, were there other contexts you thought of including? Were there other scenes, other histories, Reno's family, or other things like that that nearly made the cut and then didn't? And how did you decide which of those contexts you were going to include?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, well, I purposely didn't include any of her own history in the book. And it's easy after the fact, you know, to come up with a sort of, I guess, you know, just an account for why I did that. But I think I was sort of trying to get around subjectivity, namely hers, because she's the principal narrator of the book. And I think that there's become maybe in particular in American fiction, there's a way in which psychologization is used to explain the decisions that characters make. You know, oh, so-and-so is this way because of his or her upbringing. And I chafe against that. And I think it's problematic for all kinds of reasons that would take too long to explain and bore you. But so I excised all of that. And it was actually never even there was no exercise for me as a writer to begin with, who is this woman? What is her name? Where does she come from? Who is her family? What are her experiences? I went without all of that and just tried to create a kind of mind who I hope on the page functions closer to thought. And that's partly why she has no name, because the reader is meant to have a collapsed experience that is her impressions of the world around her. Because she's affected by the people she chooses to interact with, then I wanted their histories to kind of rise up. With the character Valera, who comes from Alexandria, I think I got the original idea for his history because Marinetti is from Alexandria, and you know, some of his most famous poems are about being there and having a Sudanese wet nurse, and there's this whole complicated racial component that informs the trauma for him of modernity and the way that he overcame it by deciding that speed and electricity and noise and explosions are actually great, but I think he was really traumatized by all of that. So I wanted to just think about it, and so for making a character that was somewhat like that and trying to build his psychology as a project of history was just interesting for me and fun.
Okay, next we've probably got time for maybe two more. Man at the, yeah.
Hello. I'm just thinking about, you've all talked about both contexts of readers and of writers. And this question, I suppose, applies to both in a way. If, and obviously this is quite a big assumption behind this question, but if, you know, the world, globalization means that we're all basically becoming more and more the same, right? I mean, eventually will there just be like one reading public and one sort of type of writer? You know, there won't be post-colonial novels, or there won't be, you know, or the different sorts of contexts from which writers emerge or readers emerge. Are we eventually all going to be reading the same?
No.
No, it's impossible, because I think it would be like trying to imagine humanity losing its capacity or its appetite for love. It seems to me that people will always fancy individuals. They'll always want one person. They won't all want the same person, although of course there is a movement towards that in the media, that, you know, one perfected idea of what is beautiful and so on. That, we're watching that happen, but I think it would certainly, it's impossible to imagine on the current evidence that people won't always try and seek out something that is absolutely part of what they have imagined and then found, or found and imagined it simultaneously. I can't believe that people will end up reading one novel that covers all.
No. Okay, who's next? Yes.
This is a question for Andrew. I wondered if you could talk a bit about what kind of strategies a writer can use when they don't understand the context that they're writing about or they're witnessing.
I think one of the things that is, for me anyway, and one can only be relentlessly subjective when it comes to these things, but for me, what novel writing is about is somehow having the antennae somewhere to know when there's a possibility of creating a strand of DNA, if you like, that if you like, the material of your unconscious or your morality or your sexuality or your reading of the world.
The external context that they're writing about.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that external context, that's material and your material, and they have to lock onto each other.
What do you do about factual errors that can come in?
Well,
that's what I'm talking about. What does a novelist do about getting their facts right?
Well, I mean, one interesting thing is that all three of these novelists have worked as journalists at the various different points.
yeah, I mean, there's a very straightforward answer to that. You just work like a dog to get it right. You report. I mean, you go to the classroom, you find out where, you just check everything. I mean, with students, I'm always telling them, they don't understand that you can't just sit in your study and dream it all up, although good luck to them that can. I mean, there's a certain amount of, if you want to talk about what it's like in a particular room in a particular day, you need to go there and look, in my view, but that's one kind of writer. Some people just only write about what they've already pre-imagined in some way, and they wouldn't check, but I mean, I feel I check everything. Do you check everything?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But I think I also choose to write about realms in which I have a natural, organic interest. So the curiosity precedes the project of writing about the place. So I've built up some accretion of knowledge, and then I get to put it into play in the writing. It's not like, I want to write a novel about X, Y, Z, and then learn about that stuff and then write the book. It's more like I want to activate what I already sort of have started to collect as a body of knowledge. But then, yeah, of course, check everything.
I mean, with research, you do the research, and then, in a way, you have to forget it too, don't you?
It's a bit, like you, I've worked in journalism a lot, and I love journalism. I'm not one of those people who thinks that there's a hierarchy of forms with the hardback novels at the top, and everything else is a slow sort of degradation until you get to sort of whatever, writing blogs or something. I think it's all good. If you're a good writer, then you don't write badly ever, unless you're just not trying. But you shouldn't sort of put on your shirt and tie for a special occasion when you're writing your novel and everything else is shit. That would be depressing. So everything I've learned in journalism has affected my sense of what you do on the page of a novel. And it's not just about checking facts, but it's also about when the facts aren't enough. Often a novel arises at the moment. I mean, we've been in international context, especially you, Pankraj, where, yes, you could easily write a long essay about Burma. He has. But there'll be a moment for some writers when you say, this is beginning to become something else. It's attaching. That's what I meant by DNA. DNA is different. It's mutating. It needs a different pace, a different order of characterization, a different lens, almost. And that's what... But journalism always helps me in that way. It lets me know what I've got.
Yeah, I think so. I'm so sorry, but we are going to have to finish because we're already over. But thank you so much, and especially thank you to our panel.